not until, recently when we introduced neighborhood preference legislation could someone have a real shot at getting access to the affordable units that are built in their community. Specifically, we just opened a 98 unit senior housing development, and mostly funded by HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and a lot of subsidies attached to it because it's for really low income seniors. Over 6,000 applications, and there's just no way that with 6,000 applications that come from everywhere would there be a real chance of people who live there actually getting access to any of those units. And so our neighborhood preference legislation was passed at the Board of Supervisors in 2015, and HUD told us in 2016 that we wouldn't be able to use it. And I flew to DC, I met with representatives, with city officials here. They joined us, and we really tried to communicate to HUD exactly why this was so important and so needed, and how their law, which they claim is meant to make sure that it doesn't perpetuate segregation, was doing just that. And so we convinced them, and they decided that they would allow us to use an anti-displacement preference. And what that means is not necessarily a neighborhood preference, meaning district-wide preferences, but we would only look at those neighborhoods that have a large amount of gentrification, like the Western Addition, the Mission, the Bayview, Hunters Point, where large populations of folks have been displaced, large numbers of individuals have been displaced, and we would be able to grant those particular census blocks, based on census block data, preference for affordable housing that they qualify for, which is now called an anti-displacement preference, which in some ways is probably almost better than a neighborhood preference, because it really does identify those neighborhoods that have suffered gentrification the most, in the city, and give them a preference which will in essence help support the communities that we really want to target for these opportunities. So I'm really proud of that legislation. I'm proud of the work that we did together to make it possible. I think that had we pushed for a preference years ago, like New York, they had neighborhood preference legislation passed in the late 1970s. And so they've been using neighborhood preference in their housing policies for years. But here in San Francisco, I'm not sure who dropped the ball. Clearly, our housing advocates and elected leaders and others decided that it wasn't something that was a priority. And for me, I didn't understand why, if we're going to build all this affordable housing, and we've witnessed year after year after year the occupancy of people who aren't necessarily from the neighborhoods, yet many of the people from the neighborhoods are sleeping on people's couches or in cars or in shelters, people who are struggling to live here. And why is it fair that they should not have at least an advantage at accessing some of the affordable housing that we continue to ask them to support? So long history, a lot of mistakes that probably would have made a difference in the past had we moved forward with a legislative policy like this. And I'm just really glad that we're doing it now, finally.